Section 7 of My Very Own Fairy Stories by Johnny Gruelle. The Rubbery Dubbery Smiles. The Rubbery Dubbery Smiles. Once there was a queer little old lady with a wrinkled face and silvery white hair, and she worked charms. That was why she was a witchess instead of a witch. She wore black-rimmed glasses across her nose, for she could not see well without them. And behind the glasses twinkled two merry little gray eyes, for she was a happy little old lady witchess. One day, a man from the village passed through the woods where the witches lived, and, as he was tired and thirsty, he stopped at her door to rest and ask for a drink. "Grandmother," he said, as the witches answered his knock, "might I trouble you for a gourd of water?" "Certainly, my dear," the witches answered, "and you may have food also if you wish it." "You are very kind, grandmother, but I have no money to pay you for the food," he said, as he felt through his empty pockets. The witches turned and winked her cheery eyes at the black cat and made no reply. The man felt through all his empty pockets until he came to one in his waistcoat over his heart, and there he found a purse filled with money. The witches had charmed it there when she turned to wink at the cat. "You dear old grandmother," laughed the man, as he pulled the purse from his pocket and looked at it. "You must have placed it there, for I had no purse when I started from home." The witches was always doing kindly things like this for people. The man with the purse found out when he returned to the village that whenever he took a coin from the purse that the witches had given him and helped some poor unfortunate with it, another coin came into the purse to take the place of the one he had spent so well. So, all the people in the village learned of the kind witches and liked her. One day, the witches brought her little stewing kettle from the house and built a tiny fire under it, for she wished to experiment with a new charm she had found. This new charm was a beautiful piece of green glass which she had found near the roadside. So she placed it with her other charms around the kettle. There was a wire nail, 2 walnut shells, a white marble, a brass key, and a suspender button. These were the witchess's charms with which she worked all her good magic. Into the tiny kettle the witches then poured a cupful of molasses, a pinch of salt, a stick of chewing gum, and a rubber band. Then the witches stirred it with a crooked stick and sang a queer song as she walked around the fire. Soon the mixture began to boil and bubble, and the steam rose and floated away. A party of people riding through the forest smelled the magic stew and stopped to inquire what it might be. They rapped loudly at the witch's door just as the magic stew was finished. The witches ran around the house to see what it might be, and when she saw it was the king and his courtiers, she felt very pleased that they had stopped at her tiny home. After she had greeted the king, he asked her what she was cooking that smelled so good. "It smells like molasses candy," laughed the king. "I'm making some rubbery-dubbery smiles, Mr. King," the witches replied, bowing to the ground. "I must see them, grandmother," cried the king, as he dismounted and started around the house, followed by the witches and all of his courtiers. But when they came to the tiny kettle, they found that the magic smile broth had burnt while the witches was away, and the rubbery-dubbery smiles had turned to frowns and had jumped from the kettle and flown away through the forest. The kindly witchess was sorry, and told the king that if he would return the next day, she would make another stew of smiles, very rubbery-dubbery ones, and that he might have one for his very own. "I do not know where the ones I had in the kettle have disappeared to," she said, "and as they burnt, I must clean the kettle very well, and that will take me all day." "We will be back tomorrow," the king laughed, as he and his courtiers rode away through the forest. The witches put out the fire and started cleaning her tiny kettle, for she wished always to keep the rubbery-dubbery smiles on hand to give to people who needed them very much. When the king and his courtiers rode through the castle gate and dismounted, the grooms who ran out to hold the horses all had frowns on their faces. But the king and his courtiers had enjoyed their ride so much and were so busy laughing and talking, they did not notice how glum the grooms were. When the king walked into the castle and met the queen and put his arms around her, he saw that her pretty face was all wrinkled into a frown. "What is the trouble?" asked the king as he stopped smiling. "Don't you feel well?" "Just wait until you go into the audience room," the queen said. So the king hastened into the audience room and saw all his ministers and generals seated at a long table, and with them were many strange men, and all their faces were pulled down into ugly frowns. "What can be the trouble?" asked the king as he put on his crown and took his seat upon the throne. "We do not know," cried the king's prime minister. "At least we are not quite sure. These men are from the kingdom of Happy Glen and have come upon a mission to Pleasant Land. While we were all chatting a few moments ago, they became silent and their faces grew dark with frowns, and as we have done our best to entertain them, we have just about lost our tempers." And the king's prime minister had to bite his lip to keep from saying more. At this, one of the strange men arose and frowned at the king, and frowned at the queen, and frowned at everyone else about the room. Now, it happened that when the magic stew of rubbery-dubbery smiles had burnt and turned into frowns and blown away, the wind was blowing toward the king's castle. It had carried them right into the room where these men were sitting, and the frowns had settled upon their faces and upon the face of the queen. All of the frowns except one, and the man who had just risen from his chair had been sitting upon that one. So, when he got up, the rubbery-dubbery frown blew up from the chair and settled upon the laughing face of the king, and his face grew dark. "We will have war," said the strange man in a loud voice. "Then we will have war," cried the king, and all the ministers and generals, and their faces were all wrinkled with frowns. The strange men all frowned darkly, and drawing their swords, cried, "War! War! War!" And the king's generals drew their swords, and frowning darkly cried, "War! War! War!" And they would have fought, but the courtiers who did not have the rubbery-dubbery frowns upon their faces rushed between the men. So the strange men left without bowing to the king or queen, nor did the king or queen bow to them. When the men from Happy Glen left the king's castle, they frowned at everything they met. And when they came to the witchess's house, they found her making more rubbery-dubbery smiles, and they frowned at her. And the king and all his ministers and all the generals followed the men from Happy Glen, and when they frowned at the witchess, the king and his followers frowned too. The witchess knew in a moment just what the trouble was. So she took the new rubbery-dubbery smiles from the tiny kettle and threw them up into the air. And then the new rubbery-dubbery smiles flew from the kettle and settled upon the frowning faces of the strange men from Happy Glen, and upon the faces of the king and his followers from Pleasant Land, and covered up the rubbery-dubbery frowns, so that everyone had a cheery smile upon his face. And the men from Happy Glen smiled at the king and said, "Hello," in a cheery manner. And the king and his followers said, "Hello," to the Happy Glen men in a cheery manner, and they all shook hands. "We were on our way to the castle to ask all of you to come to the wedding of the Princess of Happy Glen," the strange men said to the king. "We shall be delighted to come," answered the smiling king and his followers. So they all rode back to the king's castle to wait until the king put on his party clothes. And when the king went in and told his queen of the kind invitation, she still wore the rubbery-dubbery frown and said that she would not go, for she still remembered the frowns of the strange men. So the king thought a moment and then told the people to wait. The king ran from the castle and rode to the house of the witches as fast as he could go. "Grandmother, have you any of your rubbery-dubbery smiles left?" he cried as he ran up to the witches. "I'm afraid not," she said, "for I threw them all up in the air when you were here before." But the witches went to her tiny kettle and looked, and there, sticking in the bottom, was one rubbery-dubbery smile. The king was very glad to get it, and he hopped upon his horse and took the rubbery-dubbery smile to the queen, and the frown left her right away. When the king and his queen and all the courtiers and all the ministers and all the generals and all the strange men left the king's castle on their way to Happy Glen to the wedding of the beautiful princess, they passed through the woods where the witches lived, and when they saw the witches standing at her front door, they all gave 3 cheers in her honor, and the man from Happy Glen said she must accept a very special invitation to go with them to the wedding of the beautiful princess. And the queen asked the witches to ride in the carriage with her, and the witchess's gray eyes twinkled merrily as she stepped into the royal carriage. So everybody went to the wedding of the beautiful princess of Happy Glen, and the witches made lots and lots of cheery, rubbery-dubbery smiles while she was there, so there would always be plenty of new smiles when the old ones wore out. And after the wedding of the beautiful princess of Happy Glen, the king and his queen loved the witches so much they coaxed her to live with them at their castle. "There is a secret to making the rubbery-dubbery smiles," the witches said one day. "But ordinary, everyday, cheery smiles are easily made. The only magic required is the magic in a loving kiss, and everyone has this magic. So, if anyone sees a frown upon the face of a little boy or girl, all she has to do is place a cheery, smiley, loving kiss right on the top of the frown, and the frown always leaves, and a smile takes its place." End of Section 7. Section 8 of My Very Own Fairy Stories by Johnny Gruelle. Uncle Clem. Uncle Clem felt the disgrace keenly. Not that Uncle Clem was exceedingly proud, but one hates to be humiliated before one's friends. Uncle Clem's eyes blazed fiercely, if you call the shine of 2 shoe buttons blazing, for Uncle Clem's eyes were nothing more than shoe buttons, and although he said never a word, the other dolls knew that Uncle Clem was thinking mighty thoughts way back in his sawdust head. Only that very morning, Uncle Clem was dressed in his Highland costume, the same costume he wore when Santa Claus brought him to Marcella's home. To be sure, it was a trifle mussed and soiled, but there were no holes in his kiltie, and his little Scottish cap sat as jauntily on his head as it did the night Santa placed him by the chimney. Then, when Marcella turned her head to another member of her family, the kitten reached over and gave Uncle Clem a box on the ear and upset him. Yes, sir, and all the other dolls looking on. Just then, who should call but Mamma, and Marcella had to go downstairs. Uncle Clem raised up and told the kitten that she was very rude and that she should be taught better manners. But the kitten only cuffed Uncle Clem on the other ear, which sent him over on his side, for the kitten did not understand Uncle Clem's language. When Uncle Clem's head hit the floor with a soft, sawdusty bump, Fritzy raised one ear and opened one eye. The kitten was enjoying herself too much for Fritzy's peace of mind, so he bounded out of his basket with a bark and grabbed Uncle Clem by the legs. My, how Uncle Clem's head hit the floor as Fritzy shook him up. Bumpity-bump. The kitten went scurrying out of the room, for Uncle Clem's sawdust was flying in all directions. Of course, it did not hurt Uncle Clem even a little bit, for Santa takes good care to free all his dolls from pain before he leaves them on Christmas night. But it was a very humiliating experience for Uncle Clem, and he did not like it. Fritzy was having the best time of his young life when Marcella, hearing his growls, ran upstairs to see what was the matter. Fritzy immediately ran to his basket, for Marcella told him he was very, very naughty. Poor Uncle Clem. His kiltie was hanging in threads, and his face was very dirty. His hat was gone, and his legs were twisted. He was very angry at Fritzy, but he still wore his smile, for it was sewn on with brown yarn. Fritzy, from his basket, rolled up his eyes at his mistress, and looked as though he felt sorry. This did not help matter with Uncle Clem. His kiltie was ruined, and it was taken off. He was given a Buster Brown coat from one of the other dolls, and it was so small it hardly reached below his waist, and the sleeves came above his elbows. Then Marcella put one of the dolls' lace bonnets on Uncle Clem's head and placed him on a chair right in front of all the other dolls. Then, taking Fritzy under her arm, Marcella went downstairs with Uncle Clem's torn kiltie to tell Mama all about it. My, how the dolls laughed and giggled now that Marcella was not in the room. They called Uncle Clem's sister and one of the boy dolls, a German boy with blue glass eyes and a chamois skin body who would say Mama when he was tilted backward and forward, whispered to another boy doll, "Isn't her bonnet becoming?" Uncle Clem never said a word, but he felt his disgrace keenly. Soon Marcella came back upstairs and took Uncle Clem away. He was very thankful to escape the stares of the other dolls. The dolls missed him very much in the 2 nights and 2 days Uncle Clem was away, for he was the only man doll in the nursery, and his mustache always curled up in a pleasant smile to calm their fears when mice came into the room at night to play. On the 3rd day, just after Papa came home at noon and lunch had been eaten, Marcella came up to the nursery with a new doll. She showed it to Fritzy, and then gave him a little cuff, saying, "Now, you naughty puppy, if you spoil this one, I shall put you out into the street where the dog catchers will get you." Fritzy wiggled his tail and blinked his eyes as if to say he would be good after such a threat. Marcella played with the new doll all that afternoon, and the rest of the dolls were very curious, but they never even once turned their heads in order to see the new arrival, and it just happened that they were in such positions they could not see without being turned around. That night, when Marcella closed the nursery door and bid them good night, her footsteps had hardly died away before all the dolls' heads twisted around in the direction of the newcomer. As they looked, he raised himself from the doll's chair in which Marcella had placed him, and they saw that he was a policeman. Upon his pretty blue suit were many shiny brass buttons, and on his breast a nickel-plated star. He had a lovely blue helmet on his head, and it, too, had a shiny star upon it. His blue pants had vermilion stripes on the outer side of each leg, and in his right hand he carried a policeman's stick. As he approached the group of dolls, he called, "Hello," and spoke their names. They were all very much surprised until he came close. Then they saw it was Uncle Clem. The little German boy was so startled he fell over backward and said, "Mama!" But Uncle Clem lifted him to his feet and told them he had forgotten all the past and felt no ill will toward any of them. "For," said Uncle Clem, "we have to live together, and we should all do our best to make each other happy. Why, I do not even feel hard toward Fritzy or the kitten, and from now on I shall look at life in a different manner." And the dolls all noticed then why Uncle Clem seemed different. He had 2 new lovely blue glass eyes in place of the shoe buttons he had worn before. End of section 8.